Picture yourself standing amid the crumbling remains of Chopa's castle on a frigid winter night. The wind howls through broken battlements, carrying with it whispers of screams that were silenced 4 centuries ago, but somehow still rebound off the cold granite like a deranged echo. If you venture into the ruined tower where the Countess herself was bricked up alive, you can almost taste the metallic tang of iron mingled with the sickly sweet scent of decay that once poisoned these halls. It's the year 1610. Deep below in the castle's dungeon, a woman of noble blood reclines in a bath, but it isn't filled with water. The liquid is darker, thicker, it steams in the icy air as if breathing. In the flickering candlelight, her pale, wrinkled skin glistens crimson. With trembling fingers, she dips her hands into that steaming pool, convinced that this ritual will restore her youth, her beauty, her power. Yet the life force swirling around her is that of a girl barely 16, a servant whose only crime was catching the Countess's hair in a brooch while brushing it. For that single mistake, she paid with her life, and with more than her life. This is the story of Elizabeth Bathory, the so-called Blood Countess, whose name became synonymous with unspeakable cruelty. Before we press on, if you're as fascinated by history's dark corners as I am, go ahead and tap that like button, subscribe for more deep dives, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. It's incredible that we're connecting across time and space, piecing together forgotten truths. A noble birth, and a twisted legacy. Elizabeth Bathory was born in 1560 into one of the most influential families in Hungary. To be a Bathory meant prestige, power, and a reputation that stretched across Eastern Europe. They were touted as dragon slayers, vampire hunters, and political heavyweights who shaped the region for generations. But every glittering legacy hides its rotten core, and the Bathory family tree was twisted by inbreeding that concentrated not only wealth but also madness. Her uncle Istvan was infamous for violent rages and sadistic spectacles inflicted on prisoners. Her aunt Clara dabbled in the dark arts, mixing potions and teaching young Elizabeth rituals that blurred medicine into witchcraft. Imagine a precocious child, bright-eyed and beautiful, sitting wide-eyed as an execution unfolded before her, a peasant woman accused of stealing grain, stripped, shackled, and left to freeze in the courtyard while the family watched from the warmth above. Elizabeth pressed her face to the windowpane, transfixed as flesh turned blue, purple, then black, and fingers snapped off one by one under the relentless frost. She didn't flinch. In that moment, she learned that power wasn't just the ability to save a life, it was an intoxicating thrill to snuff one out ever so slowly. Growing up, Elizabeth was taught the expected lessons of nobility, literature, multiple languages, philosophy, the carriage and civility befitting a countess. Yet in the privacy of her chambers, she was also absorbing her family's darkest teachings. By age 11 she'd witnessed her first execution under her father's orders, and that chilled fascination nestled into her psyche. She started to believe that cruelty, far from being abhorrent, was simply the other side of power. Embracing the art of cruelty. At 15, Elizabeth was married off to Ferenc Nadasdy, a celebrated military commander known as the Black Knight. This arranged marriage was meant to cement alliances, but Ferenc brought more than political advantage back to the castle. He returned with techniques of interrogation and torture learned on brutal campaigns against the Ottoman Empire. Stories of battlefield cruelty, hot irons, and precise, painful interrogations ignited something in Elizabeth. Her honeymoon wasn't spent in a rose-lined suite or dancing halls, it was in the dank dungeons, experimenting on servants whose only crime was displeasing their mistress. Crushing blows with a club, red-hot pokers searing flesh, needles driven beneath fingernails, Elizabeth learned to wield pain like a surgeon wields a scalpel. She discovered 2 critical truths: the human body could endure far more agony than she'd ever imagined, and the rush she felt from inflicting that pain surpassed any luxury, any fine wine, or opulent court intrigue. The occasional murder, hidden, hushed, written off as an accidental fall or a runaway servant, became a personal lab for her burgeoning obsession. But Ferenc's illness and subsequent death around 1604 changed everything. Officially he succumbed to disease, though rumors whispered that even he recoiled from his wife's growing brutality. His passing left Elizabeth a widow with vast estates, immense wealth, and, most dangerously of all, complete autonomy. She was 44, showing the first unmistakable signs of age that would become her deepest torment. Unchecked and unchallenged, she unleashed her darkest desires without fear of reprisal. The first drop of blood. The story of how Elizabeth escalated from hidden torture to systematic murder begins almost by accident. One morning, as a young servant girl helped her dress, the Countess's hair got caught in a brooch. Elizabeth spun around in a rage, slapping the girl so fiercely that her ring carved a deep gash into the servant's cheek. Blood spurted across Elizabeth's hand, and when she examined that crimson droplet, she perceived something extraordinary. The skin where the blood had touched looked smoother, more luminous, as if the years had rolled back in that instant. Whether it was mere bloodlust or genuine belief, Elizabeth convinced herself that blood held the magic of youth. From then on, she didn't just want to wound her victims, she wanted to kill them, collect their blood in silver bowls, and anoint herself in it like some perverse cosmetic. She conducted small experiments at first, a pinprick here, a shallow cut there, just enough to gather fresh blood. She'd apply it to her cheeks and stare at her reflection for hours, searching for any flicker of renewed beauty. A ritual of murder. Over the ensuing months, Elizabeth's experiments grew crueler and more elaborate. She developed macabre ceremonies drawing on her aunt's folk magic. Victims were stripped, bound, and slowly tortured in soundproof chambers, their blood draining into basins positioned beneath a makeshift throne. She believed terror purified the blood, making it more potent. Some prisoners languished for days before death came, more agony meant stronger elixirs, in her warped logic. The castle's basement became a grotesque slaughterhouse. Bodies were buried in secret graves, dumped into the river, or left for wild animals. The stench of decay was masked by incense and herbs, but no mask could hide it completely. Remarkably, this murder spree continued for years without serious investigation. After all, in a society where peasants vanished daily, who would blink an eye? As Elizabeth's obsession deepened, her choice of victims shifted from anonymous servants to girls of minor nobility. She believed their purer blood would yield stronger results. Invitations went out under the guise of finishing their education or learning household management from a seasoned countess. These young women arrived with letters of introduction and gifts, unaware they were walking into a trap. Families received occasional postcards, painstakingly forged by Elizabeth, assuring them their daughters were thriving under her tutelage. But each postcard marked another girl lost forever. The first noble victim was Anna, a distant cousin and barely 16. Her parents enthusiastically welcomed Elizabeth's offer, imagining their daughter would benefit from refined instruction. Instead, Anna was stripped, bound, and tortured over 3 days. Her blood drained into silver basins, her screams muffled by thick tapestries. When Anna failed to return home, her anxious parents traveled to the castle demanding answers. Elizabeth, ever the gracious hostess, feigned shock. She suggested Anna might have eloped with a local squire and offered to aid the search. But Anna's mother noticed her daughter's distinctive family necklace adorning Elizabeth's neck, and suspicion bloomed into horror. By late 1610, whispers of missing noble girls reached the royal court. King Matthias II, eyeing the sprawling Bathory estates and eager to settle long-standing debts, saw an opportunity. He appointed Georgi Thurzo, Palatine of Hungary and a relative by marriage, to investigate. Thurzo was known for discretion and thoroughness, qualities essential when pursuing a countess. He quietly interviewed families of the disappeared, bribed local officials for records, and coaxed frightened servants into speaking. Witnesses recounted muffled cries, bloodied garments, and the desperate flight of survivors. Over months, Thurzo amassed a dossier so damning it would shock even the most hardened skeptic. On the grey dawn of December 29, 1610, Thurzo and a contingent of soldiers crept through the mist to Chopa Castle. Their mission: secure arrest warrants and gather incontrovertible evidence. As they passed through the great hall, a stench of decay churned their stomachs. Soldiers gagged, but they pressed on, descending into the labyrinth of torture chambers. In one room, 2 bodies lay side by side, faces contorted, wounds fresh. Nearby, a basin brimmed with warm blood. In another chamber, dismembered remains were arranged with ritual precision. The most gruesome sight awaited in Elizabeth's private quarters, an ornate silver tub filled with congealing blood, flecks of flesh floating amid steaming ripples. Scattered around were personal items, clothing, locks of hair, even jewelry stolen from victims. They found Elizabeth herself nearby, her hands stained crimson. Under guard, she stared at them with cold defiance. Thurzo's team also uncovered her diary, hundreds of pages detailing experiments in torture, notes on blood purity, and sketches of devices designed to maximize suffering and blood collection. Some entries referenced recipes taught by her aunt, mixtures of herbs and blood meant to enhance skin elasticity. Other passages read like a doctor's casebook, listing which methods produced the warmest blood and which breeds of victims yielded the best results. The handwritten confessions were as damning as any testimony. Rather than risk a public trial for one of Hungary's most powerful nobles, King Matthias arranged a private solution. Elizabeth's 4 primary accomplices, Dacia Sentas, the elderly witch advisor, János Ujjari, her dwarf bodyguard, Ilonaya, the procurer of victims, and Catalin Beatty, the grim disposal expert, were put on public trial in early 1611. The court unfolded like a macabre theater. Witnesses described torture rituals in vivid detail, servants wept recounting escapes, and local officials confessed to accepting bribes. Sentas and Ujjari attempted to shift blame, but the physical evidence, bloodstains, instruments, architectural modifications for soundproofing, left no doubt. All 4 were found guilty and executed, their deaths serving both justice and deterrence. Elizabeth Bathory herself escaped the executioner's block. Declared legally untouchable due to her noble status, she was instead confined within the upper tower of Chopa Castle. 3 small chambers, a bedroom, a prayer room, and an antechamber, were sealed behind thick brick walls. A narrow slot allowed food to pass, small vents handled waste. Shuttered windows barred sunlight, and bars prevented any real view beyond the turret. Guards were instructed to bring meals but never to speak more than necessary. Thus the Blood Countess was sentenced to live, and die, alone. For nearly 4 years, Elizabeth languished in her self-made prison. Initially she raged, threatening invisible foes and demanding justice. She rattled the gates, cursed her guards, and wrote desperate letters begging release. But over time her fury soured into resignation and then into madness. She spoke to ghosts of her victims, accusing them of conspiring against her. A small hand mirror was her only companion. She gazed at her reflection for hours, monitoring the inexorable march of age across her face. Without fresh blood rituals to sustain her delusions of youth, her mind unraveled. Guards reported hearing her recite incantations that mixed Latin prayers with broken folk spells, half prayer, half curse. Physically, the conditions were brutal. The cold stone walls leached warmth, and her diet of coarse bread and thin broth provided scant nutrition. Lack of exercise and sunlight withered her once celebrated beauty into wizened ruin. Her voice, once commanding dozens of terrified servants, now echoed only in solitude. She grew gaunt, her skin pale and veined. Occasional guards claimed she asked for death, while others said she prayed for release. Yet she outlived every expectation. On August 21, 1614, the guards arrived with her morning meal to find Elizabeth Bathory dead in her narrow bed. She was 54, an age she had once feared but ultimately could not evade. The official cause of death was natural causes, though whispers suggested suicide. There were no marks of violence, her features bore the wear of years of isolation. Her body was wrapped and carried to the castle chapel for burial, but villagers claimed the ground shrieked beneath her coffin. Rumors swirled that curses leapt from the crypt, so authorities moved her remains to the Bathory family vault at Ext. Even there, her tomb was left unmarked, a silent warning, some legacies are too dark to commemorate. Cactus Castle was abandoned almost immediately. Hawthorn and brambles reclaimed its ramparts, and the locals avoided its ruins, believing the stone still whispered the agonies they had witnessed. Over the centuries, Elizabeth Bathory's real story merged with myths. Some claimed she'd struck a pact with demons, others believed her to be a vampire preying on villagers. Folktales embellished her kill count from dozens to hundreds, then to over 600. Artists and writers across Europe seized upon the legend, painting her as the ultimate femme fatale, an immortal beauty who bathed in blood. But historians in modern times have painstakingly separated fact from fiction, acknowledging both her documented cruelty and the hyperbole that grew around it. Elizabeth Bathory's tale endures because it touches on universal fears, the hunger for power, the terror of unchecked authority, and the lengths to which vanity can drive us. Her victims, real girls with families and futures, are the tragedy at the heart of this nightmare. Their names have largely vanished, but in every whispered account, in every chilling tale told by castle guides, we glimpse the cost of one woman's monstrous ambition. In the centuries since Elizabeth Bathory's death, her story has lived on in two parallel streams, one rooted in documented history, the other flowing into folklore, legend, and pop culture. Scholars have pored over surviving court records, royal correspondence, and testimonies to separate fact from fantasy. Modern historians generally agree that while Bathory almost certainly tortured and killed dozens, perhaps over 100, servant girls and young noblewomen, the oft-cited figures of 650 or more victims likely stem from sensationalized accounts and later mythmaking. Still, even at the lower estimates, her crimes stand among the worst of her era. And the very fact that a noblewoman could commit atrocities for years without repercussion reveals much about the dark side of power and privilege. So how did Bathory's tale morph into the stuff of vampire legends? Part of it traces back to the 18th and 19th centuries, when Gothic fiction was on the rise. Writers and artists seized upon the grotesque image of a woman bathing in blood and wove it into vampire lore, undead beauties who prey upon the living to maintain their youth. In Bram Stoker's Time and Beyond, the trope of the female vampire with an insatiable thirst for blood echoed stories like Elizabeth's, even as the real historical details faded or were exaggerated. Film, literature, and art drew from her narrative, transforming a brutal serial killer into a supernatural archetype. In that way, Bathory's legacy became larger than life, a cautionary myth about the perils of vanity and the dehumanizing effects of seeing others as mere resources for your own gain. But beyond the legends, there's a deeper lesson in Elizabeth Bathory's tale, one that resonates today. She operated in a system where her social rank shielded her from accountability. Officials were either too scared, too bribed, or too indifferent to act. Servants and peasants lacked legal standing, so their disappearances barely registered on the county ledger. Even her husband's death, which might have curtailed her activities, instead freed her to pursue her blood rituals with fewer constraints. This dynamic, where institutions fail to protect the vulnerable and allow abuses of power to persist, remains hauntingly relevant. Whether in corrupt corporations, authoritarian regimes, or closed social circles, the same mechanisms that enabled Bathory's crimes can still be found when oversight vanishes and silence becomes complicity. Another thread worth tugging at is the psychology of evil and obsession. Bathory's initial act, slapping a servant girl and seeing her own blood, sparked a delusional belief that blood held the secret to eternal youth. From there, she rationalized ever more extreme violence under the guise of medical experimentation or mystical ritual. This mirrors how, today, people can become trapped in destructive ideologies or addictive behaviors, convincing themselves that the ends justify the means. When unchecked by morality or empathy, obsession can warp perception and obliterate boundaries between right and wrong. Bathory's story reminds us that evil often starts small, an impulse, a justification, and grows until it becomes normalized within a closed circle of enablers. And what about the victims, those girls whose names we may never know? Their lives were stolen not for political gain, not for wealth, but for the narcissistic fantasies of someone who viewed them as mere instruments. In honoring their memory, we have to acknowledge the human cost behind every statistic. Those were daughters, sisters, friends with futures abruptly ended by cruelty. Today, as we consume true crime podcasts or binge crime dramas, it's easy to get caught up in the lurid details. But Bathory's case challenges us to look beyond the sensationalism, to remember the real people whose suffering makes for shocking headlines. Their voices were silenced, yet by telling their story responsibly, we give them a measure of restoration. So how do we reckon with this dark past? First, by demanding transparency and accountability at every level of power, in governments, institutions, and communities. When we see warning signs of abuse or neglect, we need to speak up, investigate, and protect those who cannot protect themselves. Second, by nurturing empathy, recognizing that every person, regardless of status, has an intrinsic value that must not be violated for someone else's benefit. And third, by maintaining a healthy skepticism of myths that glorify or romanticize violence. The allure of vampire tales or horror stories can be entertaining, but we should never lose sight of the reality they echo, that unchecked cruelty devastates lives and corrodes our collective humanity. As we step away from the stones of Cactus Castle and leave behind the echoing screams, one question lingers: what whispers are we ignoring today? Where in our world are people suffering in silence, victims of those who wield power without conscience? History doesn't just belong in books, it lives on through our choices. By learning from Elizabeth Bathory's reign of terror, we can remain vigilant against the temptations of power and vanity that still haunt us. We can choose to break the cycle of silence and stand up for dignity, justice, and compassion. If this journey into one of history's darkest chapters spoke to you, hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dives, and ring the bell so you won't miss our next exploration. And please, share your thoughts below. Have you encountered other stories of hidden cruelty in history? Where do you see the echoes of Bathory's legacy today? I'd love to hear your insights. Until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and remember, the past has much to teach us, if we're willing to listen.